if you're constrained, if you're in prison, your freedom is internal, a spiritual awakening, honesty, lack of addiction. If you are unconstrained and free and in a free society, the threats to your freedom are internal. You're addicted to your smartphone, you're addicted to alcohol. Those are all diminishments of your freedom.
Since we spoke last, you have had an amazing near-death experience. What was that like?
It was terrifying in ways that combat never was. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, which is this little artery that no one really needs to think about very much. It's very rare. It was the result of a structural abnormality in my abdomen. It wasn't related to any health issue. There were no symptoms. It was completely undiagnosed. I'm a pretty healthy person, so it's not like I get a lot of CAT scans or anything. And it just ticked away in my abdomen for years or decades. And one day I was talking to my wife and I felt this pain shoot through my stomach. Not unbearable, but whoa, what was that kind of pain? And within a couple minutes, I couldn't stand up because my blood pressure was tanking. I didn't know it, but I was bleeding out into my abdomen. The aneurysm had ruptured and was gushing blood into my own abdomen. Thank God, didn't know this. The mortality rate for this is 70%, 70, if you get to the ER fast. And I was an hour and a half away from a hospital. And pretty soon I started to go blind, and all things that happen when your blood pressure drops. The ambulance finally got there, and I was feeling a little better. You go into something called compensatory shock. Your body clamps down on everything, and your blood pressure goes back up in your core and in your brain, and you feel better. So I was like, oh, maybe I'm okay. My vision came back, and I was like, huh, that's weird. But spouses being what they are, I was sent off to the hospital, and I got there right at the point where my compensatory shock seemed to wear off, and I went off a cliff, and I was actively dying, and I was minutes from being dead. But I was conscious the whole time. I had no idea I was dying, but I was conscious. I was talking to the doctor, and they cut my neck open. They figured out what it was pretty quickly, and massive abdominal hemorrhage, and which those are real widow makers. And the thing is, if you just had a knife wound in your stomach, they would know where to put their finger or whatever. With abdominal hemorrhage, it's a complicated mess in there, and they don't even know where to start looking for like a rupture. And so they cut my neck open, and they made an incision in my neck to put a needle, a line into my jugular. And they started transfusing me. In the end, I got a total of 10 units of blood, which is quite a lot. My blood pressure was 60/40 when I got to the ER. I'm guessing I had about half my blood by the time I got there. And I started to leave, and I felt myself leaving, and my dead father appeared above me. And you have to understand, I'm an atheist. I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. I'm a rationalist. I'm not a mystic. If anything, I'm kind of an anti-mystic. And I cannot explain what happened. My dead father appeared. I didn't know I was dying, and I was shocked to see him. And he was sort of welcoming me, like, it's okay, you can come. And I was like, get out of here. You're dead. I'm alive. I don't want to come to you. What? We have nothing to do with each other. You're dead. What are you talking about, right? And then I started to get pulled down into this black pit that had opened up underneath me. And it was just sort of infinitely black, infinitely dark, and a void. It was just this enormous void underneath me. And I felt myself starting to get pulled into it. And I said to the doctor, you got to hurry up. I'm leaving. You're losing me right now. I didn't know that I was dying, although I was. I just meant I'm getting pulled into the huge black pit and I don't want to go. Right? I was being very literal about it. Like, you got to hurry. I'm going right into the pit. And he was working on my neck, and then my memory is spotty after that. But it's a great mystery. And what happened on the threshold, and it's sparked a lot of feelings. It's terror. I was very for the past since then, like for about a year after that, I had a real anxiety disorder that I could just sort of die at any moment, and it made me very agoraphobic. I didn't want to be away from, anywhere where someone could help me. Had I been on an airplane or in a traffic jam or camping, I'd have died. And so it gave me a real sort of panic disorder, which is very common for this kind of thing. And but it also awakened a kind of curiosity about death. And do we really? I just believe when you die, everything stops, and that's the end of that forever. And it made me wonder, like, how can I really know that? And I think the Christian vision of heaven and all that, I think is frankly just nonsense. And all the other major religions as well. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of post-death, non-material reality that we just don't understand yet and don't understand in scientific terms. And so I'm trying to navigate through that very complicated and terrifying and confusing terrain.
Yeah, it sounds it, to see your father like that. And I remember the last time we did an interview, you mentioned that your friend, the late Tim Hetherington, sometimes you'd see him in dreams. What do you think this sort of visual connection to these other people, what is this kind of telling you?
I mean, we dream about things that are important to us or emotionally important to us, and it's easy to explain that with what we understand about the human brain. I mean, dreams aren't any mystery whatsoever. But then if there is a non-material post-death reality, it does open the question, can the dead trigger dreams in us? I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. And I don't want it to be that way, but I'm just saying, like, if we really don't know what happens after death, and if there's a possibility of some reality that can intersect with ours in some ways, like maybe when you dream of the dead, maybe in some ways there's something real happening there. I don't know. And again, I don't necessarily want that to be true. I don't care either way. I don't have a dog in the fight, but it does open what the experience did to me was make me realize in my sort of smug agnosticism, you know what, bro, you actually don't know. You know what I mean? And because you don't know doesn't mean that there is anything after death, but you don't know any more than Christians don't know, and Buddhists don't know, and agnostics don't know either. Join the club. Nobody freaking knows. And they got me to that point.
What do you think it would take to convince you? Is there something that could kind of set you on a path where you would start to believe in some sort of afterlife or something?
I mean, I would need some data. I mean, I would need a measurable effect. I would need, like which people are working on. They just, it's not there. So either we aren't smart enough to develop the tools that could measure what needs to be measured to prove that, or there just isn't anything there. This is all a kind of wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of touching on religious systems here, and with your latest book, Freedom, I wonder what relationship do you see between joining a religious group and freedom?
Well, joining any group expands your freedom and diminishes it. So and I'm speaking in anthropological terms, humans do not survive by themselves. They die very, very quickly. They physically die in the wilderness. They psychologically die in solitary confinement. They often sink into depression and anxiety if they've been ostracized or banished within their community. You have to belong to a group to survive and thrive. And because we are social primates, and we're not designed to exist on our own in any way, shape, or form. So belonging to a group enables the primary freedom of the fact that your life will continue. Like, you will survive, you will continue, because the group will help protect you, will help sustain you, will support you psychologically, defend you physically, like help get you food, shelter, etc., all the things humans need. Groups are great at doing that, and individuals cannot do it for themselves. So ultimately your freedom, any experience that you have as a person in the universe comes from the fact that you are part of a group. And we are all part of a group in the sense that we were part of industrial society, and all of our physical needs, our immediate survival needs, are met by being part of that system. We are part of that group, even if you don't belong to the bridge club. I'm not talking about that kind of thing, right? But then once you're part of a group, you have to abide by its norms, or you get thrown out of it. So that's a constraint on your freedom. So I'm not free to run red lights. I mean, I am free in a sense, but I'll suffer repercussions. Mm-hmm. So if you're part of a group, you can cross its norms, you can betray its rules, but you will have to pay the price. And one of the interesting things to look at is situations where people have decided to free themselves from the constraints of society and go off into the wilderness, literally the wilderness, in order to live free lives. And that was often a motivation for early settlers, say along the Pennsylvania frontier a couple hundred years ago. But what they found was, and part of my book Freedom is about this, what they found was that it was a very, very dangerous place. The wilderness is dangerous. It was filled with native peoples who did not want them there and were very happy to wage war and cut people's throats to get rid of them. And that the settlers who poured into the wilderness seeking their own freedom, their own autonomy, really couldn't survive out there unless they engaged in a kind of collective defense with other people in the area and erected a stockade that they could rush to when the settlements were being attacked, and then survive the onslaught of the sort of native attacks. They could survive that. Often they could survive it, but then it meant abiding by the norms of this little society that was formed in the wilderness. And one of those norms is that adult males, and adults started at about 13, adult males had to be armed at all times because an Indian attack could come at any time. So if you were an adult male and you did not have a scalping knife and a tomahawk and a rifle on your person at all times, even plowing the fields, you were being negligent and were not abiding by the sort of social agreements, the social norms, and would be ostracized and kicked out of your community. And God forbid if you ran away during a fight, forget it, you were out, you were done. So circling back, joining a religious group, what's it do to your freedom? Well, it gives you, I suppose, a kind of spiritual freedom, the sort of uplifting effect of a group of people all believing the same thing that's known to make people feel good. But then you have to abide by its norms. And depending on the religious group, say the Taliban, sometimes those norms are pretty confining, are pretty sadistic even.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about having these groups, something as big as industrial society down to a small community, and then there's this trade-off, abiding by the norms but getting the benefits. Do you see different layers that people need in terms of maybe a small, intimate group as well as something big like industrial society?
Well, we know, throughout history, we haven't needed industrial society because it's a new thing. But what we do seem to need, is at the very least a kind of survival group, typically in our human past. That is 30 to 50 people. Sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's a couple of hundred. After a couple of hundred, in hunter-gatherer society, or even sort of Swidden agriculture and some of those things, some of the more, quote, primitive forms of survival, after a couple hundred people, it's hard for one area to sustain further growth, and so groups divide. They also tend to have political fractures after a certain size, and the groups divide up. And the bigger the group, the safer it is, up until the point where it divides because there's a internal conflict, and then it's not very safe. And so, that keeps human groups typically in a sort of indigenous environment, in an environment that reflects our evolutionary past, keeps those groups often around 30, 40, 50 people, which interestingly is the size of an infantry platoon. That seems to be a very, very good, effective size. It's sort of the maximum number of people that you can have a close personal relationship with, and the sort of minimum number of people that are needed for group defense and other kinds of collective tasks.
Mm-hmm. It seems that a lot of people feel like they're missing this sense of connection to a group, especially since the pandemic and shutdowns and things. Would you recommend that people go looking for some sort of group that size, or how would you recommend people do that?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, it's not hard to join groups. I would say joining a group online isn't really joining a group in human terms. In fact, it risks taking you out of circulation in the physical flesh and blood world, and sequestering you in your bedroom, like on your laptop, which is not very good for our mental health, and that's very, very well known. So, yeah, I mean, you can go out and join a group, but the meaning of the meaning of the group and the meaning of being part of a group increases with the necessity of the group. So if you're just meeting once a week to play soccer, awesome, but your survival isn't dependent on doing that, right? If you are part of a, quote, survival group, where a sort of hunter-gatherer survival group, where without that group, or a platoon in combat, without that group you wouldn't survive, then the meaning of being part of that group is enormous and kind of transcendent and feels very, very good. And we can achieve that even in large groups. So after 9/11, people, I live in New York City, and people in New York, and maybe all over across America, but certainly people in New York felt there was a kind of consolidation of we are this, of group identity. Like, we are New Yorkers, we are Americans, we were attacked, we will do anything to protect each other. And so I remember walking around, the smell of smoke and still in the air, and if someone was looking like they were having a hard time, and there were plenty of people who looked like they were having a hard time psychologically. I mean, you'd see people, sometimes there are people that were just stopped on the sidewalk staring, right? Clearly caught up in, oh my God, that just happened. And they were just, and I would watch people go up and say, hey man, you all right? It was very, it was very, very touching, right? During the Blitz in London, all of London was all of London was a survival group, right? And there was this call to action, and it got people to override their psychological troubles. One British official said, we have the chronic neurotics of peacetime. We all know those kinds of people. We have the chronic neurotics of peacetime driving ambulances during air raids. The Blitz of London, of course, was a 6-month stretch when the German Air Force bombed London almost every night. They killed 30,000 people, 10 times as many as on 9/11. And it created an incredible sense of solidarity in Londoners. One woman said, we would have all gone down to the riverbanks. They assumed the Germans, if they were going to attack, would come up the Thames River. And so the woman was like, we would have all gone down to the riverbanks with broken bottles to fight the Germans if we'd had to. And, this was a middle-aged lady in London, right? And so you can belong to a group, and the meaningfulness of that group depends on how important it is to your survival. And as a result, when the crisis is past, when the war is over, when the flood waters recede, this happens with hurricanes and everything else, of course. When the crisis is over, there's often a real longing, a real nostalgia for the closeness of the bonds that the crisis necessitated in the group. And so, yeah, you can go and join a group, but it's not going to quite have the same effect as if you had to join a group, because otherwise you would die, right? Everyone would die. And then when you're forced into that circumstance, the group that you wind up joining is, it's not being stuck on an elevator for an hour till the fire department saves you. You're on a life raft, right? You're on your plane crashed and you're in the jungle. I mean, what happens with that group of people that you're with is absolutely profound and a lifelong, a lifelong experience, and reproduces our evolutionary past quite accurately.
Mm-hmm. So if playing group soccer is a low threshold, what could people do to get to that sort of higher threshold, but maybe without massive risk, without a total crisis? Is it volunteering?
Yeah, but there's no, those are all great things to do, right? Mm-hmm. But there's no, the bonds that are formed in a crisis cannot be reproduced without a crisis. Mm-hmm. They just, right? That's not the end of the world. We're blessed as a society that we don't have to form survival groups to get through our crises, right? Let's be real here. Like, we're really lucky.
Yeah.
But there are psychological issues to attend to because not only are we not in crisis, we live in a society which is deeply alienated and individualistic. We have these ghastly little toys called smartphones that allow us to disappear. Allow me, like this is my phone. I don't have one of those things. That allow us to disappear into these sort of solipsistic, obsessive holes for hours or days at a time. That's not good. Like we live in single family dwellings where we rarely know or care about the people across the corridor or next door in the next house. And there are upsides to all of these things, but the downsides are a kind of fatal alienation, which clearly is connected to the high suicide rate, addiction rate, depression, anxiety. All these other things are often remarkably high in wealthier societies and remarkably low in less affluent societies. And that's because in poor societies, people aren't rich enough for every child to have his own bedroom and every family to have their own, big house on the other side of a hedge from the other family's house. People live collectively. Poor people live collectively, right? It has its own stress, but it has the advantage of a group experience that protects people from psychological harm.
Mm-hmm. What role do you think work has in that psychological connection? And I'm thinking now with so many of us working from home, working remote, how can people work with their work to also have these experiences?
Well, I think the sociability of the workplace plays to all of our sort of human traits as social primates and is both stressful and pleasurable. So yeah, right on. Like I think the workplace is an amazing thing. Clearly, people were unhappy when they couldn't go to their workplace, even though it was more convenient. But mental health really declined during COVID. If social media and digital communication were a viable substitute for the real thing, for flesh and blood contact, depression rates wouldn't have soared during COVID, but everyone was miserable. So clearly, this digital substitute for human connection isn't really a substitute.
Mm-hmm.
But it depends on the work. I mean, there are jobs that are both that involve very tight-knit groups and risk. If your job happens to be in the fire department, those guys, it's not all guys, but it's mostly guys, those guys are connected, right? They are connected even if they don't like each other that much sometimes, right? And that's the thing about, quote, brotherhood, as one of the soldiers I was with out in Afghanistan said to me. He said, the guys in this, he said, there's guys in this platoon who straight up hate each other, but we'd all die for each other. That's exactly true of the fire department. The people, the very brave people, and there's a lot of women involved in this actually, which is wonderful, involved in fighting wildland fire. Likewise, the hotshot crews, 20 person crews, very, very tightly bonded. And I'm sure that those people really miss it when they get out of that business.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do to navigate this? You don't have the smartphone, you got the flip phone. Is it your boxing gym where you get this kind of feeling, or what do you do to work with this part of your human nature?
Well, I got some of that. I used to go to a gym called Mendez Boxing in Midtown Manhattan, and long time basement boxing venue, it's mostly younger people and from all around the city, all the boroughs, rich, poor, everybody, right? And some very tough kids from some of the outer boroughs. To them, in their eyes, I'm just like an older white guy. And I started boxing 10 years ago, so you can guess what my skills are. But I worked as hard as anyone down there, and it made me feel like I was part of the fraternity. And one of the great things about a boxing gym or combat or any other number of other things is that you're sort of judged on your conduct in the group, and you could be a suit from Wall Street, or a poor kid from Bushwick, and whatever. It doesn't matter. Like if you respect the sport and act decently and respectfully, you will be liked. And it doesn't matter how good or bad a boxer you are. And if you're a great boxer, but you're sort of an asshole, whether you're a suit or you're a kid from Bushwick, it doesn't matter. You will not be liked. And that's very much how it would work in a platoon, I think. So I got a lot of sort of group experience through that. I really, really liked it. But it closed during COVID. It never opened again. Tragic. I live in a mixed income neighborhood. Most of let's say half my neighbors are Spanish speaking. A lot of them don't even speak English. My building is likewise primarily Spanish speaking. It's Lower East Side. It's very communal. It's a real neighborhood. Everybody knows each other. We look out for each other. When Hurricane Sandy hit, there was a great collective action here. One of the women in the building organized sort of guard duty. She got a machete and organized guard duty because they're afraid of break-ins because there was no power. And a lot of the families in this building had children, and there was no power, so there's no water, so they had to leave. They had to they were sort of refugees in some way. They couldn't stay down here, so the building was half empty. So the people that stayed organized, nighttime guard shifts with a machete at the door. That's communal action, right? So basically, I would never live. I mean, I wouldn't choose to live in an affluent, like a really affluent neighborhood where nobody needs to know each other or help each other. That's how I grew up, and it's psychic death. It's just horrible.
Yeah. My friend Phil, he used to call that the Batcave neighborhood because it'd be you push your garage door opener, you drive into the garage, you close the garage behind you, and you don't see anybody in a space like that.
But even those people, and I was one of those people. I grew up like that, right? Even those people, you stick a hurricane on them, they will band together immediately, right? It's all hardwired into us, and when they do, they like it. That's the crazy thing. If generally speaking, one way to know what was adaptive in our evolutionary past is to ask whether it's pleasurable or not. Eating when you're hungry is pleasurable. So it's adaptive. It helps keep our survival. Sex is pleasurable. That's how evolution, quote, gets you to reproduce. Group affiliation, particularly during a time of crisis, but even not, is pleasurable, right? It gives people a great sense of satisfaction and meaning, and that's your tip-off. That's your sign. Oh, this must be adaptive. If this feels good, this must be adaptive in our evolutionary past. We are hardwired for this. We're hardwired to like this. And you can tell, absolutely you can tell, because as soon as the hurricane hits, it doesn't matter how wealthy the suburb and insulated those people are from the ordinary struggles of life, boom, hit them with a hurricane, and they're out there collecting water and helping each other and pulling people off rooftops. It's very ennobling and gratifying to see.
Yeah. It sounds like having this demand on a person would be different than having freedom. I think the first association people have with freedom is that it's the ability to just go do whatever you want. How do you define freedom?
Well, I mean, yeah, you can go do whatever you want, but you probably won't be alive for very long. But you can do it. I mean, you can walk into the wilderness. This happens when people shoot cops and stuff, right? They shoot a cop, they walk into the wilderness, and they're dead within a week. I mean, not always, but usually. I mean, they just don't make it very long. It's very, very hard to survive in the wilderness, which is really the only place you can do whatever you want without social constraints. But interestingly, those social constraints are very powerful. There are career criminals, murderers, right? People that murder at the drop of an ear, no problem. They will not cut the line at the bank or at the post office because social pressure is so intense, right? So, and even murderers need bank accounts or whatever, or need to mail letters. So if you're going to be part of society, it's not illegal to cut the line. That's the thing. It's not no one will arrest you. You won't get a ticket. It's totally legal to cut the line, but nobody does it, right? Someone will kill you at the drop of a hat or looking at them sideways will not. It's hilarious. We voluntarily include ourselves in this society because we get so much from it. It just means we can't do whatever we want without paying consequences. You can do whatever you want. You actually can, but you just will pay consequences. And people don't want to pay consequences. You don't have to pay your taxes. What are you talking about? You do have to die, but you don't have to pay your taxes. You'll just go to jail, no problem. But no one can force you to pay your taxes. You don't have to stop at red lights. Whatever, go for it. You can do whatever you want. there are just consequences.
What do you think is the most important form of freedom?
Look, it's one of those words like love. Like how do you define it? There are many definitions of freedom, and they're all important. Some people say having no possessions is a form of freedom, right? Some people say having a lot of wealth is a form of freedom because you are not oppressed. Your freedom isn't constrained by the struggles of poverty. Absolutely true. But the problem is once you're wealthy, you have a lot of possessions, then possessions themselves are a form of bondage, right? Now, is a homeless person who has enough to eat and living under a bridge, are they more free from a Wall Street banker who makes 22 million a year and works 18 hours a day? You tell me, I don't know, right? They're both different forms of freedom. So ultimately, you have to pick your own personal one that's the most meaningful and the most gratifying. I think it's important to acknowledge that our freedom has to exist within the constraints of belonging to society because we will die without society. So just stop at the notion that you're an autonomous person that doesn't owe anybody anything. It's nonsense. When you have a heart attack, you expect the ambulance to come get you, right? And so when I at one point I called it high-speed vagrancy. I took a few guys, a couple of combat vets, and another guy who was a photographer. We walked along the railroad lines from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. It's the part of the subject of my book, Freedom. We chose the railroad lines because there's swaths of no man's land where really anything goes. They're totally unmonitored. You can sleep under bridges. We're, abandoned buildings. We're getting our water out of creeks, cooking over fires, dodging the police because it's illegal. So we were dodging the police. They were looking for us with a helicopter at one point, never quite got us. I would like to say it was a crime, but a victimless crime, what we were doing. There are these amazing swaths that cut through America, and you see America from the inside out, and you're kind of totally autonomous out there, and which means you're in danger, but you're also autonomous. We could never have done it without the group. Like we were beholden to our small group because we just couldn't have survived otherwise. But as a group, we were enormously free, and we talked about freedom, and I made this sort of like comment. I was like, this is the only time in my life where night after night, over the course of 400 miles, in the winter, in the summer, spring, the fall, we were the only people who knew where we were every night. Nobody in the world knew where we were except us. That's a form of freedom. I would say that a free society, which is what we were running there in our little group of four, a free society requires a very basic egalitarianism between members. It requires leadership that is self-sacrificing rather than self-protecting. It requires a kind of a fair process for airing grievances, and it requires the ability for the group to protect itself from attack.
I've lived in shared spaces and things like that, and it seems like a fraternity house. And the airing of grievances was a very difficult thing to navigate. We had a dedicated day where this was the day where everybody can come together and say, this is what I don't like, this is what's going on, this is something that needs to be said. What do you think that should look like in most people's lives?
Well, I mean, in our society, it's the courts, right? We have a space set aside for that so that you don't have to settle things with a 6-gun like they did in the Wild West, right? But in the sort of smaller scale, I mean, in sort of indigenous tribal societies, there was a council. I mean, there was a group discussion about, look, so-and-so slept with so-and-so's wife, and they're going to kill each other if you guys don't sort this out. What are we going to do? Okay, you chop off 2 of his fingers, and we're good. Whatever. Like, there's got to be a socially approved process by which satisfaction can be had for damage, for wrong, for insult, for injury, for loss. And what it absolutely cannot be is that the powerful can do things that the less powerful can't. Right. So, in the Middle Ages, you're right on up until, the American Revolution, basically. The kings and queens of Europe and the royalty could basically do whatever they wanted. And literally, like, they could kill, rape, plunder. the courts, there weren't any courts, the justice, society could not come after them for wrongdoing and prosecute them and punish them. They were kings and queens, right? They were divine representatives on earth. And there are church leaders who have lived basically in history. There are religious leaders that have been protected in that way as well. Enormously unfair. And one of the amazing things about the American U.S. Constitution, as flawed as it was at the time, but one of the amazing things about it is that the people that wrote it were the most powerful people in society. They're land-holding, educated white men, right? In any other circumstance beyond the reach of the law, right? And they wrote a piece of paper, they wrote a document that made themselves accountable to the law in exactly the same way that everybody else was accountable. They did not make an exemption for themselves, nor for elected officials, nor even for the president, nor for a small town sheriff. Like, everybody is accountable to the same laws. And there is no free society that doesn't have that kind of system to it.
Mm-hmm. So I think fatherhood sometimes gets a rap as being a sacrifice of a lot of freedoms. What freedom, if any, in fatherhood do you find?
Well, yeah, I mean, that starts with the presumption that we're free. I mean, we're not free, right? I mean, you go to jobs, you have to earn a living, the fruit doesn't fall from the trees. You know, when your faucet's leaking, you got to fix it. I mean, give me a break. Like, so, yeah, so you chose to have children, and children require care, or your genetic investment in the future perishes, and you're subject to criminal prosecution. Yeah, that's a loss of freedom. Sorry. Like, you know, let's be real here. But yeah, it's not, you know, it's just, I mean, there are different forms of freedom, right? So if you're homeless under a bridge, you have a lot of temporal freedom. You know, the whole day is yours, right? You just don't have any money. And when you really want to go get a pizza, you can't because you don't have money, right? Just two different forms of freedom. And when you're rich, you don't have any time, but you can buy whatever you want. Well, if you're a parent, you have the emotional freedom, at least I did, of not caring about myself that much. Like, what I really care about is my children. Now, I might have felt differently about that at 25, but, you know, I'm 60, right? I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. I'm completely emancipated, freed from obsessive concerns about my career and my well-being, other than I want to stay alive long enough to be a good father. That there's a real freedom there, a real emancipation. But am I temporally free? Of course not, right? I mean, it's, you know, sometimes a nightmare of obligation and small tasks. And I mean, every parent knows it. Like, oh my God, how am I going to get past dinner time to bedtime? Like, I'm not going to make it. Like, call 911. I'm literally going to expire. Everybody knows, right? So you're just choosing different forms of freedom. And at this point in my life, this is the form that I find so valuable, so meaningful, that it almost feels kind of sacred. And I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the big threats to freedom in the world today?
When you live in an affluent Western society protected by laws and a electoral system, the threat to freedom doesn't really come from an enemy invading your country. Like, Canada is not going to invade the United States. They sort of know better, but even if they didn't know better, they probably wouldn't. It's not in their interest. We don't have to worry about that. The Canadians will not take away our freedom by killing all of us, right? Our freedom as citizens is protected by our laws and our electoral system to a degree. It's not fairly dispensed. It's not perfect. It's not fairly dispensed, but it's pretty good, right? So in that situation, the threats to freedom don't come from an outside enemy. They don't come from a despotic ruler, you know, the kings and queens of England, say, in former times. It's internal. The threats to freedom for us are I would say our addiction, primarily. I talked to a guy who did 25 years in prison for murder, and he just got out. And I asked him if it's easier, is it possible to be freer in prison than outside of prison, which felt like a stupid question. And he He looked at me like I was crazy. He was, of course it's possible to be more free in prison. Are you kidding? He said, there's no iPhones in prison. There's almost no drugs in prison. You can find some drugs, but you can't really be a drug addict in prison. He said, in prison, you have all the time in the world, and eventually you're going to have an honest conversation with yourself about who you really are and what you're doing in there. And when that happens, you're a free man. That doesn't happen much on the outside. So if you're constrained, if you're in prison, your freedom is internal, a spiritual awakening, honesty, lack of addiction, right? If you are unconstrained and free and in a free society, the threats to your freedom are internal, right? You're addicted to your smartphone. You're addicted to alcohol. You're addicted to compulsive shopping, whatever. Those are those are all diminishments of your freedom. So, yeah, in our society, which is largely affluent, and we have basic civil rights protections, personal individual rights protections, I would say the main threats to our freedom are internal, and I think addiction is probably one of the highest ones.
Mm-hmm. So if we're not in prison, what can we do to assess those issues in our own lives?
I mean, I think you have to live a sober life, right? I'm digitally sober, if you want to put it that way. I also don't do drugs or alcohol because they don't interest me. But as a consequence of them not interesting me, I feel like I'm a little bit freer. And I don't think anyone's completely free as long as they're psychologically dependent on something. Mm-hmm. So, it's up to you. No one else is going to tell you. But you have to be honest with yourself. Like you drink enough so that you have a dependency on it. You're not entirely free. Are you, in chains, metaphorically or literally? No, you're not in chains. But I wouldn't say you're completely free. And I think digital media, social media, is an enormous corruption of our freedom. And whatever. I have a Facebook account. It's on my laptop. And I do that business when I'm at my desk, which isn't that often. So. But when you're carrying around in your pocket all day long, there's a real threat. Look, once in a while I smoke a cigarette, right? I used to smoke a little bit more. I stopped. Once in a while I have a cigarette. If I had a pack of cigarettes in my pocket, I would smoke all day long. That's how it works, right? If you have social media on your smartphone and it's in your pocket all day long, you will smoke all day long. You'll smoke your social media all day long. I'm sorry, right? So do whatever you want. If it makes you feel more free, then go for it. But ultimately, I think that's a real threat to our freedom. And I'll just sort of end my little rant here. And sorry to be so sort of verbal about it, but we live in a huge mechanized technological society where it's very, very hard to feel that you're a necessary part of it, right? It sort of grinds on without us. We're totally dependent on it, but it doesn't need us, which in human terms can make a person feel very vulnerable. In a survival group, you're dependent on it, but you also are aware of the ways in which it's dependent on your input, right? So it's okay. You feel safe because you're needed. So not in our society, right? It does not need us, and we need it. It's the ultimate psychological nightmare, and in some ways. So I would say you can demonstrate the ways in which society needs you by contributing to it. And there are three very, very simple ways that anyone can do to show your contribution to society, and society actually can't function without them. It actually would collapse without them. Democracy particularly. The first is vote. Vote. The nation needs you to vote, right? And when you do so, you thwart the plans of all the evil people that want to do things that are against your wishes, right? And if you don't vote, then shut the F up, right? Because you didn't, sorry, I don't want to hear about it. Vote. Serve on jury duty. It's fantastic. It's amazing. It's fascinating and a huge pain in the ass, but whatever. Lots of good things are, right? And it's what keeps us. It's what keeps us from being tyrannized, right? Because of jury duty, no one person can decide the fate of another person, right? It's a jury of peers, right? And a hopefully neutral judge. That's it. So no small town sheriff, no presidents, no religious leader, no head of a huge multinational corporation, Nobody can decide what's going to happen to another person. It takes a group to do that. That's why that's one of the reasons we're free. So serve on jury duty and demonstrate how valuable you think your freedom is, right? And then finally, donate blood, give blood, give blood. We manufacture it for free. They take a pint out of you, and within a couple of weeks, you've replaced it at no cost to anybody. Not only do we make blood for free, all humans need blood, and it cannot be manufactured in any other way. It's the ultimate free lunch, as Christopher Hitchens said. And one day you're going to need other people's blood. You're going to be lying there like I was on a gurney thinking, damn, if someone didn't donate some blood, I'm dying. My little girls will not have a father. I'm on the way out, but I won't be because someone donated blood. Well, you have to be that guy for other people now. And it's a very moving thing to do, and it proves that you are part of the human race and you're part of a society. And of course you need it, but it demonstrates that it needs you as well. And demonstrating that, I got to say, feels so good that it's almost kind of addictive. And talking about addictions, right? I donate blood as much as I am legally allowed to, which is every couple of months.
Sebastian, before I get to a question from one of your fans, where could folks look for you online if they want to learn more about you?
SebastianJunger.com. Sebastian, Junger is the spelling of the last name, SebastianJunger.com.
Great. We'll put a link to that and to your newest book in the description for people to check out. And Sebastian, this question from one of your fans, he asks, if the U.S. gets involved in another projected war again, what can we learn from what we did correctly or incorrectly in the recent past?
We have the military superiority to win any battle, any campaign. What we don't have the economic resources for is to sustain a long-term occupation of another country on the other side of the world. And that's what we attempted to do in Afghanistan. And we had to do that because we stood up a completely corrupt, self-dealing government over there that did not have the respect or the loyalty of any decent Afghans. And it was basically a huge criminal cartel. I would recommend reading my dear friend, old friend, Sarah Shays, Chayes, reading her on the matter. I channeled her thinking and interviewed her for a piece that I did for Vanity Fair after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I can't remember the title, but it's easily found, about how our policies in Afghanistan failed because we did not do what virtually all Afghans wanted, which was to end corruption in their country. They allowed the Taliban to come into Afghanistan in 96, and I was there in 96, and I watched it happen. They allowed the Taliban to come in 96 and take over because the Taliban promised to clean up corruption, and indeed they pretty much did. And they were an awful institution, and Afghanistan's well rid of them. But we did not substitute any mechanism to carry on that good work of fighting corruption. And so the effort collapsed because the Afghans didn't see their lives improving under us. So what I would answer is, there are wars that have to be fought. I think after 9/11, Afghanistan, chasing Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was one of them. I actually really think that, right? Not Iraq, but Afghanistan, right? And the majority of Afghans were very, very welcoming of us. They wanted their civil war to be ended by the presence of weapons forces, and so it was not really a hostile country, but for the Taliban contingent. So, but my answer would be, we can't fight wars and then conduct 20-year occupations that stand up corrupt regimes. Like that's just stupid, and it wastes lives. It wastes Afghan lives, and it wastes American lives.
Well, Sebastian, thank you for your frank journalism and your thorough writing on these topics. I really enjoy it, and thank you for spending your valuable time with me. Thank you.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this episode. To help get more great guests on the show, be sure to subscribe.